This morning we're going to be talking about an introduction to the bee and pollinator project here, and this is a project that we're working cooperatively with Oklahoma State University, Texas Tech University, Tarleton, and I think that's everybody right now, and Texas A&M Commerce. We've got some folks over there that are working on bees also. So what I hope to do with you today is just give you some basic bee biology and background, because I'm not going to assume that anybody is a bee expert, although there may be some bee experts here. Some of you may know more about bees than I do, but I wanted to kind of give you some of that background, and then I'm going to answer specific questions about how the project works. So, angiosperms, the flowering plants of the world. These plants have been around for 120 million years ago, 120 million years. Insects have actually been around for about 400 million years. So insects were here before flowering plants, but when flowers started to be produced by plants, insects were there and created a real reason for flowers. Surprisingly, with all the history that humankind has had with flowers, it's not been that long since somebody figured out what flowers were really for, biologically speaking. Nehemiah Grew in 1682 wrote a book where he talked about the anatomy of flowers and plants and proposed the idea that they were sexual organs for exchanging male and female gametes and producing seed. And you think, wow, we've known that forever, haven't we? No, we haven't. Ancient Greeks didn't understand it. The Romans and early European history, the Chinese didn't understand exactly what flowers were for. We originally thought of flowers primarily as being something that they were the Creator's gift to man, and they certainly are beautiful gifts, wonders that I thank God for every day. But biologically speaking, that wasn't a very sufficient answer for why flowers exist. A guy named Christian Conrad Sprengel in 1793 was studying the Wood's cranesbill flower, which you see here, and he made observations that it seemed like to him the flower was designed specifically for bees. It had he said the nectar of the flowers is secreted for the sake of insects, and he noted that the nectaries are protected from rain in order to give the insects a fresh supply and yet allow the insects to get into the flower and pollinate it. And Charles Darwin showed the value of cross-pollination. Why don't plants just pollinate themselves? Well, Darwin showed that there's fitness benefits to cross-pollination. There's more genetic diversity in a population of plants. It actually makes plants hardier and stronger. And we see that in the value of hybrid-type plants in farming. So without assuming that we all remember high school botany and biology, this is a diagram of a flower. And you'll notice that we have in the middle we have the stigma, and that's going to be the pollen receptive tissue, where the female part of the flower that's going to get the pollen that's going to land on the stigma and become fertilized. So that those little pollens actually create a tube that goes down the stigma into the ovules and fertilizes the eggs of the flower. And the secret of pollinators is they help transfer that pollen from the male stamens of the flower to the female stigma. There's a lot of different agents of pollination in nature. We have wind, and many plants are wind pollinated. We call them anemophilous plants. Pine trees are a good example. Grasses are good examples of wind-pollinated plants. Many of our grain crops are wind-pollinated. Bees, and we've got a little asterisk by the bees because of all the agents of pollination. Bees are by far the most efficient and most effective. But also flies, butterflies, moths, beetles, wasps. We actually have vertebrates like birds and bats that will pollinate certain types of flowers. We have a little fig wasp, which have an interesting biology too, and sometimes mammals will help pollinate plants. So, but by far the most important pollinators in nature are insects. There's over 275,000 different kinds of plants that are pollinated by insects, flowering plants. 80% worldwide of world crops are dependent on insect pollination for seed production and fruit production. In the U.S., it's about 2/3 of all plants, and you'll often hear the old saying that about 1 in every 3 bites of food that you eat is directly due to bee pollinating a plant. And we actually call that now in ecology circles, we call them pollination services. And we've tried to, in many instances, put an economic value to these little bees that are pollinating our food crops, because they are providing us a service. It's one of those invisible services of nature that normally we don't think too hard about. And to me, this is really interesting. One of the benefits of insect pollination is that it allows plants that are not right next to each other to cross-pollinate each other. And I was thinking about this the other day, and actually the internet makes a strange analogy to this. Before the internet, how did you find out where to buy shoes or groceries? You went to the local grocery store, right? And now, with the internet, you have the ability to buy your shoes from a little dinky store in Oregon, somewhere on the coast, and you never have to leave your house because you have the ability to communicate with that store via the internet. Well, plants are the same way. Normally, plants would have to be close to one another to be cross-pollinated, but because of insects, you could have a little orchid here isolated in the woods somewhere, with the next closest orchid being a half mile away, and it's still able to be pollinated because the bees can find those orchids and carry that pollen long distances. So what it does is, just like the internet commerce, the internet allows small businesses to live and exist and have a lot of diversity of businesses out there. Just like similarly in nature, it allows a lot more plant diversity and ecological diversity to occur just because we have pollinators that make these pollen transfers. Now, unfortunately, we have, like most things in nature today, there's issues and crises going on. We know that pollinators, in many cases, some species of pollinators are in decline. Some of the bumblebees in the U.S., for example, we know from insect collections that have been made over the last 200 years that bees are not found in some of their original native ranges anymore, that their ranges are shrinking. We know that some bees are disappearing and no longer can we find them. We think that probably the number one reason for that is destruction of habitat. As we plow down the prairies and remove woodlands and flower areas, natural flower areas, we're moving habitat for bees. And we also have issues with pesticide use. We have parasites and pathogens sometimes that have been brought over from other parts of the world that are affecting our bee populations. So we think that about 60% of our pollinating bee species are in risk of some form of decline. And again, this whole thing about loss of habitat is so important. And one of the reasons that you all are so important is because I know as gardeners, you care about having some of these plants, these flowers, these native plants in your own yards, and trying to preserve some of the biological diversity. And the good news is, of all the insects that are out there, the pollinators are some of the most mobile and most able to benefit from the gardening that you do in your own yard if you take the time to build a pollinator garden. So just a little bit about biology here too. Plants go to great lengths to attract insects, some of the things you might not have thought about. Plants produce nectar, they produce pollen, those are the obvious things. They also produce fatty secretions that attract some insects. They sometimes create actual food bodies like pollinia in orchids that can be very attractive to insects. They produce scents. The smell of flowers is partly to attract pollinators, resins that they emit, and also nectar guides that we'll see a picture of in just a second here. But this is very beneficial to the plant to have that bee there, and you can see the pollen load on the bee. and as the bee moves around within that flower head, it's transferring pollen from one floweret to another floret. Now, some of the nectar guides that plants produce, really, nobody even knew they existed until we had the ability to photograph things in ultraviolet light. And these two are the same flowers. The yellow flower on the bottom is natural light. The one on the top is ultraviolet light. That black spot in the middle is creating a target. It's saying, here I am, bees, come here. There's nectar and there's food in here. So if you're a bee and you're flying around and you see that target sign somewhere in nature, you're going to fly to it because you know that there's plants that are advertising for your services. It's only visible to bees, not to people, because bees can see into the ultraviolet light range of light, which we can't with our eyes. Now, these are some visible light pollen guides too, and you will see these veins that, again, next time you go out and look at flowers in your garden, see are there signs of pointing signs to the nectar sources in your flowers. On many plants there are. Now, flies are one of the pollinator groups that we're going to be studying in our research this summer. And flies are a little bit different than bees. They usually are attracted to plants for nectar, although some of them will feed on pollen. The flowers that are really designed to attract flies tend to be smaller and less how do I say it, pleasantly scented. Flies actually like stinky stuff because, a lot of flies are attracted to things like carrion and dead things. But if a plant smells that way, it can attract some of those flies. And there are plants that are specifically fly attractors. Not really well studied. The ecological interactions between flies and plants is a lot less studied than bees are. The Lepidoptera, which of course is a term that, for all the moths and butterflies, these are insects that have very long proboscises. And so they have the ability to feed in flowers that have longer tubular forms. So here's a heliconid butterfly, and you can see the mouth part going into the long tube down there. Generally, the flowers that attract butterflies are going to be very sweet smelling because butterflies use that smell to orient. Moth-pollinated plants tend to be the flowers that open at night. Some of you probably have flowers that open fully in the evening and at night, and they tend to be white, and those are usually plants that are designed specifically to attract moths. The day-flying butterflies are going to generally be attracted to flowers that have the longer corollas, and again, because they've got long mouth parts. And they oftentimes will have the landing platforms on the bottom of the flower. You'll notice that ledge at the bottom that allows this white butterfly to land and sip nectar. And then there's the Hymenoptera, which is the order of insects that has the bees, the wasps, and the ants. Now, we don't do a lot of ant pollination. It's pretty rare, but there are a lot of wasps that are attracted to flowers for nectar and also do pollination services. But by far, the bees are the most important group for reasons we'll see in a minute. And worldwide, we have 20,000 different kinds of bees. I mean, that's a mind-boggling number of different types of bees that come to flowers. When you say bee, what do you think? You think of a honeybee. And the honeybee, of course, is actually a very odd bee in terms of bee biology, as we'll learn in a minute. But again, plants that depend on bees often tend to be bright. They have nectar guides often. So most of the really pretty flowers in your garden they've evolved that way specifically to attract bees. The family that we refer to as bees, or the superfamily, is the Apoidea. There's 4,000 different species in the U.S. or in North America of these bees. All of them feed on nectar and pollen. So whenever you see a bee, you know that it's a nectar and pollen feeder. Most of the species of bees that we have are not social. Most of them are solitary, which means that they don't cooperate with other bees to make a nest. They make their nest separately. Their bodies, probably one of the best characters of bees is their bodies tend to be covered with these very fine brushy hairs that trap pollen especially well. So when when insects were starting to co-evolve with plants that wanted to attract bees, one of the beneficial features of the insects that were really good at collecting nectar and pollen was they had these hairs that were very good at transporting pollen. And the bees, as a group, have evolved to have those types of hairs. And it's a little bee anatomy here. So here's a bee. This is actually a male bee. You know how you can tell? Male bees have a little more parts than females. If you look at the abdomen, there's 7 segments on the abdomen of a male bee. There's only 6 on females. So those white stripes, if you count them, plus the tip there, that's 7 segments. If you counted the antenna, the males have 13 antennal segments, the females only have 12. So it is possible to tell these apart. Obviously, you need either very good eyes or you need a microscope or magnifying glass to see these things. However, I'm just saying it's just another mystery that you don't have to wonder about. How do you tell a boy from a girl bee? And there's another easy way to tell a boy from a girl bee, at least to tell a female bee for sure. If she's carrying pollen, it's almost certainly a female. The males generally don't carry pollen. So if you see a yellow dusted bee floating around your garden, it's for sure a female. The other thing is you'll notice down here in the lower right there's a circular diagram, and it's got those are pollen grains, and I wanted you to see the structure of the hairs on the bee. Bee hairs tend to be split end, so they tend to have these frizzies all over them, and that helps catch the pollen, and that's what's different about bee hair than wasp hair, seedy, or any other thing. They have these very specialized hairs on their body. So one of the things I want to do with you, and one of the things you're going to have to do as volunteers this summer, is know the difference between bees and wasps and flies. So let's talk about how when you're out there in your garden and you see something fly to the flowers in your garden, how you can tell the difference between a bee and a wasp. So the first one is, to me, a little hard to tell on some of these insects, but bees tend to be a little heavier bodied. Now, there are exceptions. Now, the bee is in the upper right of this picture. The one on the upper left is a yellow jacket wasp. Now, what's the main difference you see between those two? Okay, there is coloration differences. Notice that the bee has hair, lots of hair on its body. Wasps tend to have fewer hairs. You won't see pollen accumulating on the body of wasps. Now, they will carry pollen, but generally pretty sparsely, so you won't necessarily see a yellow covered feet on a wasp. Wasps tend to have longer legs with spines. Bees tend to have fatter, stubbier segments of the legs and covered with hairs and sometimes pollen. And if you see an insect with the wings folded in half, like this yellow jacket in the upper left, that's an indication it's a vespid wasp. Many of the wasps that visit flowers are vespids, and they have that folded wing characteristic. And this is a better picture. This is a paper wasp. Note the wing is folded. Notice how the bottom edge of that wing is flat. That's because the wing has been folded in half like that. That's their resting position for wings. When they fly, of course, they unfold, but at the resting position, you may notice that. So I'm trying to train your eyes very quickly here today in the training to start to see some things that you might not otherwise have noticed when you're watching your flowers and counting pollinators. And this is another one. This is a eumenid wasp, also called a potter wasp. I'll show you a picture of what the nest of these wasps look like. They're pretty cool. But this is also a vespid wasp, and you'll notice the flat wing edge on these as well. Now, honeybees and bumblebees will mix nectar with the pollen and make it kind of wet and sticky, and they'll stick it into pollen baskets on their hind legs. So if you see something with a pollen ball on the hind leg, it's almost certainly going to be a honeybee or a bumblebee of some kind. The other species of bees tend not to do that. So this is a honeybee, if you don't recognize it. And how do you recognize a honeybee, by the way? You kind of learn the size. It's a medium-sized bee. It has the golden, kind of the golden brown and dark, very dark brown, almost black stripes on the back, and they're very hairy. This is what you're probably going to see in more cases. You're going to see bees with their bodies covered. In the case on the left, the bees' legs are very heavily covered with pollen. That tends to be the case in the apidae, the bees that are most closely related to bumblebees and honeybees. And then the one on the right, where's the pollen accumulating on that one's bodies? It's also on the legs, but where else? On the underside. That's a key characteristic of a family of bees called the megachilid bees. And that's just a nice example of another type of pollen-carrying position on a bee. Now, I know it's a little light in here. This is a paper wasp, or a specid wasp. Now, this is one that does not have folded wings, but what do you notice about this that would tell you it's a wasp? Look at the legs. The legs are skinny and they're spiny. Remember, that was one of the characteristics of wasps. And also, and my pointer's not working here, but the joint between the body, the main body where the legs are attached, the thorax, and the abdomen there's a little stalk there, a very narrow waist. And that's characteristic of wasp, not bees. So in a few days or weeks, hopefully you're going to be able to look at this stuff and you're going to be the expert. You're going to know, oh, that's definitely a wasp versus bee. Okay, bees versus flies. Now you think, oh, that's an easy one. I know what a housefly looks like, but not all flies look like houseflies, and some flies look a lot like bees. So on the right here are two insects. One is a fly and one is a bee. Which one is a bee? The one on the bottom. Now, what's the principal way you can tell a fly from a bee? And if I've taught you entomology, introduction to entomology as a master gardener, you should know the answer to this. 2 wings versus 4 wings, right? So flies have 2 wings. That insect on the top only has 1 pair of wings. The insect on the bottom, the bee on the bottom, has 2 pairs of wings. So that's immediately going to tell you. Now, is that easy to see? No, it's not that easy to see. Maybe an entomologist it seems kind of easy, but it takes some practice. But if you get a fly to sit carefully, quietly on a flower, you can see that. Now, the other thing is to learn the face of bees and flies. The faces of bees and flies are very different. Bees tend to have these oval, elongated eyes on the side of their heads. Flies tend to have these eyes that wrap around the head and sometimes come almost together at the top of their head. So we're going to see some pictures, and I want you to notice those things. Also, bees have, and this, for many of you, this would be the easiest thing. Bees tend to have long elbowed antennae. An elbowed antenna has a long scape at the bottom, and then it has the flagellomeres, the small segments on the end, so it bends like in the middle, like an elbow. Flies tend to have really short aristate antennae. You're not going to see them. You might see a little hair-like structure in the front, but they're going to tend to be a little finer, at least the ones that are common on flowers. So, how many wings do these have? These both have 4 wings. So, see the wings there. Again, I'm just trying to train you to see these things. See that second bump as you follow the edge of the wing around. Notice there's a second bump there just below the first wing. And that's what 4 wings looks like. Now, bees actually have little hooks on the back side of the forewing that catch up with the front edge of the hind wing called hamuli. And hamuli, actually, when a bee flies, the 2 wings are hooked together with those hamuli. So they act as a single pair of wings. And so they do tend to stick closely together. But you can train your eye to see the 4 wings with a little bit of practice. Remember those eyes. The bees tend to have the oval-shaped eyes on the sides of their head. Now this is the smallest bee in the U.S. versus one of the larger carpenter bees. Perdita is a very small, it's the smallest bee in North America, and then Xylocopa is one of the larger genera of bumblebees. And just to show you the difference in size of bees. If you think you know what a bee looks like, but tend to ignore the little tiny flies, the gnats that seem to be hovering around in your flowers, you might be missing bees, because some of these bees are very small and fast, and they're hard to pick up. But look at the eyes, and compare them to the fly's eyes. Notice how the fly's eyes are now, they're wrapping around the head, and they're coming almost together at the top. So that's going to be an easier characteristic probably to see for you in the garden than trying to count wings. Also notice the short antennae on this fly. That's more characteristic of a syrphid fly or hoverfly. Here's another picture. Now this is a blowfly, which looks more like a big hairy housefly. But again, even though the eyes don't meet at the top of the head, they're bigger and tend to surround the head more. And notice the antenna. This is what we call an aristate antenna. It's a short, stubby base that's got a little spike-like antenna, very thin-haired antenna coming out of the side of it. And this is very common on flies. This should be when you think of fly, think of the face of the fly, the big eyes and the wispy antenna. And just some more flies. You're going to see some interesting insects on plants this summer if you spend some time out in your garden at all. The one on the left, your left, is called a robber fly. Now robber flies are very stout. Notice the big heavy legs. Those legs are designed to grapple a prey, a large bee or a moth, and wrestle them to the ground while they bite into the body and paralyze the prey. These are monster flies, and some of them are very kind of scary. I have pictures on my computer of hummingbirds being attacked by these robber flies. There's a couple of robber flies that are big enough to actually take on a hummingbird. But anyway, most of them are going to be a little smaller than that, and they are predators on bees and other pollinators. So you might see them grappling with a bee. The one in the middle is a very typical syrphid fly, or what we call hover flies in the study. And you'll notice the yellow and black stripe looks very much like a bee coloration, right? And why do insects have bright yellow and black coloration in nature? It's a warning signal. It's called aposematic coloration. It's saying, don't bite me, I got a stinger, and I'm going to hurt you if you bite me. And in order for a bee to have benefit of that stinger, it's got to have predators that have the memory of attacking one of those stinging insects. And by showing themselves off with this yellow and black coloration, they warn predators to be careful. Now, the syrphid fly is totally harmless. It wouldn't hurt a fly, right? It doesn't have a stinger, but it's appropriated aposematic coloration to make it appear dangerous to predators. So you've got these whole families of flies that tend to look like bees merely to protect themselves from insects that have been conditioned to avoid the bright colored bees. So it's kind of neat, but it makes it harder, your job a little harder, because they can look very similar when they're visiting a flower. So what would be a difference here between telling that from a bee? Okay, 2 wings, which is going to be hard to see. Look at the eyes. Those big old eyes, that's probably the most obvious thing. And also the antenna, really short, stubby, with that wispy antenna called the arista.
And they won't have any hair on them?
Well, mostly not. But there are some bees that have very sparse hair too, so it can be a little tricky. But I don't expect you all to get everything right perfectly. We're going for pretty good. And then this guy, this is the one on the right is, you're going to see these this summer once you start looking for them. That's called a long-legged fly. And long-legged flies are very pretty. They tend to come in iridescent colors. They have very long legs, and they're small. They're very tiny. And maybe we might even see some out here in the garden when we go out at the end of the class today. So interesting behaviors. Bees and wasps, some of them are what we call solitary in their nesting behavior, and some are social. And I think few people understand the solitary life cycle of a bee. So let's talk a little about this. In the upper left corner of this picture, it shows one of the mining bees. And mining bees have little holes that they dig in the ground, and they'll make chambers off of that hole. And the picture shows a ball of pollen in that hole. So they've taken some of the nectar and they mixed it with pollen and made it into a little ball that they bury in these holes. And on top of that ball of pollen is a larva. After they make their pollen ball, they will lay a single egg on that pollen ball. The egg hatches into a larval bee, and the bee will spend its whole growing up life feeding on that pollen ball. That pollen ball has got enough protein to create a bee. And so each of those little cells at the bottoms of the tunnels are going to turn into bees next year. So you will, if you have sharp eyes, you will see from time to time see these colonies of bees that are living in the ground, and they'll just look like little tiny holes. And I went out and looked at a colony of bees on our property yesterday, and I knew where they were, but I'd forgotten how small they are. Some of these are very tiny bees, and the holes are, I don't know even how to describe the hole, maybe 1 to 2 millimeters across. They're very tiny holes. Some are bigger. This one right here on the bottom is, there was a bee colony out at Lila, the Lake Louisville Environmental Learning Area, and this is a bee called Diadasia. And Diadasia feeds on primrose, and they collect primrose pollen, and they will leave the little pollen balls right at the entrance to their nest. And if you ever look at primrose, the evening primrose growing here in Texas, its pollen is white. So you notice that pollen is kind of whitish around the nest. Why they do that, why they ring the mouth of their underground nest with pollen balls, I'm not sure, but it's very distinctive if you ever encounter them. And these are examples of solitary bees. Now, sometimes multiple bees will share one tunnel, but they're building each cell separately, and they're not really cooperating with one another. Or they may tend to build separate tunnels from each other, but they like to live in the same spot because there's not that many really good nesting sites around, so all the bees in the area will use the same patch of ground for a nesting area. So you might see some of these in your garden. And also, if you've got a little bit of space and you can leave a bare spot in your yard, that's actually very attractive to some of these bees, and you can increase the diversity of bees in your yard if you leave some bare spots on your property. Especially sandier soils work really well. There's also a group of bees in the honeybee subfamily called carpenter bees. And carpenter bees they don't feed on wood, but they excavate wood, just like a carpenter. And I've actually got some examples of some carpenter bee nests up here that you're welcome to look at. But they will bore into a soft piece of wood, go down and make usually a right angle and make these tunnels, and they'll fill the tunnels with pollen and then seal it off. They'll fill another section with pollen and seal it off, and they'll do that until you have a bunch of cells in here that hold bees. And next year, the offspring of those bees will come out, and usually they'll start excavating in the same spot. Now this picture in the upper right, that's a lacy oak in my backyard. And I went out one May and noticed, there was a perfectly round hole in that tree. I thought, oh darn, the carpenter bees are getting into my tree. And the second picture on the right was only a month and a half later. That tree had already grown enough that it had sealed off that carpenter bee nest. The bee apparently didn't use the gallery, it just built it and then abandoned it. But you'll notice, see how fast the tree recovered from that drill hole in the tree. I was really impressed, and apparently that was a good year for that tree because it grew a lot and did a lot of sealing. But anyway, those sorts of things are going on in nature all the time, if you have the eyes to see them. And how do you recognize carpenter bees? Carpenter bees are one of the easiest bees to recognize. They look like bumblebees. They tend to be more black, uniformly black, but not always. But they have a shiny abdomen. When you see them on the flower, they don't have very many hairs on the back of the abdomen. So it's going to look shiny and kind of bare. So you can tell this is all shiny on the back of that abdomen. That's a carpenter bee. And two more examples of carpenter bees. Again, these are the big bees. We have some examples of these bees in the bee box up here. And carpenter bees are, we get calls in extension about these because sometimes they can become pests in people's patios and backyards and barns and other things. This is on the back side of the fascia board of this house. The carpenter bees have started drilling into that wood and using it as a nesting site. And all the stains on the wood are the pollen feces. As the bees are flying out of the nest, they're dropping their droppings and staining the wood under the house. That's not really hurting the house, but the wood that's being chewed on the other side, which you can't see, is the damage. Now, another kind of interesting thing about carpenter bees is they're nectar thieves. They don't tend to go in the right way on plants. And if you watch these carpenter bees, you'll see that they seem to be more interested in the sides of the flower than they are in going through the middle of the flower. And if you look closely, the jaws of this bee are piercing the bottom of this flower. And in doing so, they actually bypass the plant's mechanism for getting pollinated. So they're nectar thieves in that regard. So they're not helping pollinate the flower when they do that, but they are getting nectar out of the flower by going into the nectaries at the bottom. They're not good pollinators, at least on that kind of plant. They wouldn't be.
Damaging the bloom, I guess?
You know, I never see damage to the blooms. It's kind of like a surgical attack. You know, they go in, get the nectar, and come out. And I think the flowers continue to bloom for a normal period of time. At least, maybe somebody else knows different, but I don't, like a vampire. Another real common bee that you'll see in this area are the leaf-cutting bees. These are the megachilid bees. And the way we first see these usually is the little round dime-shaped holes that are cut out of leaves in your garden. You'll see this commonly on roses. I see it on photinia leaves. There's a variety of different plants that they'll do this on. But what they're doing is they're cutting little round pieces of leaf to wrap around their pollen balls and eggs that they're going to put into a cavity. They're cavity nesters. Now this one is using, it might be an old carpenter bee nest or old wood borer. It didn't actually, leafcutter bees won't make those holes in wood, but they will find existing holes and use them. And again, they're pretty interesting. This is a picture of a whole bunch of these leaf-rolled, they look like cigars almost, and inside those are those larvae. You can see those larvae. We've opened a couple of the leaf rolls, and they'll see what the larvae look like. But they're inside those rolled up leaves feeding on pollen that has been provided by the adult bee. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You get a picture of what's going on? Okay. Another one, and one that's really popular among gardeners, is the mason bee. And mason bees are also in the megachilid family, but they will often make use of mortar and rocky areas to make nests. In this case, this was kind of an interesting situation. That was a white limestone wall on a house, and they were calling me about bees going in and boring into the rock on their house. Well, I looked closely at pictures of the rock and actually went out to the site, and my best guess was that there were holes that were already drilled in that rock by the construction people. Nobody had ever noticed them. They were pretty obscure, but the bees noticed them, and when they found those holes, they went in and started using them. I don't believe the bees chewed their way into solid rock or even into solid mortar, although they will sometimes pull out loose mortar to make nests. But mason bees are the bees that frequently now are being touted online as being wonderful bees for your garden and encouraging people to make bee hotels. And mason bees are one of the species of bees that will make use of these artificial habitats that you can put out in your garden. And speaking of which, here's some examples. And you know, this is kind of fun. Gardening is supposed to be fun. And one of the things that you can do to spice up your garden is to make a bee hotel, and you're actually creating more habitat for bees to come in and settle in your garden. This is a very simple one on the left. It's just basically a bunch of bamboo like you see in this commercial bee box here that's been stuck into a box. And why did they put chicken wire over that? Yeah, it's to keep the birds out. Now, I don't think that was a very effective use of chicken wire because a bird could still peck into those twigs and pull out the bees, but the idea is sound. The one in the middle is in my garden, and I just had fun with it. I drilled some cedar blocks, different sized holes, and had a piece of wood that I drilled some holes in, and I stuck bamboo in the rest of it. You know, and I have people come by all the time our house and say, "What is that?" It's a bee house. Oh, and you know, not really a feel how that could be a beehive. You know, they think of, again, everybody thinks of honeybees. This is not a honeybee house. This is a solitary bee house, bees that use tubes for nesting sites. So again, there's a lot more to bees than what you might have thought before you came into this class. Now, honeybees do not pollinate your tomato plants. Did you know that? Honeybees do not have the ability to pollinate tomatoes. Tomatoes have very tight flowers. The only way they can be pollinated is by something called buzz pollination. And bumblebees can do that. And these bumblebees are grasping onto the flower of the tomato, and they're vibrating their wings. They're beating their wings very quickly, and they're shaking the flowers on the tomato. And that's what can pollinate, loose the pollen and pollinate the flowers in your tomatoes. So if you have lots of tomatoes in your garden, don't thank the honeybees. They had nothing to do with it. It was bumblebees, or else it was just wind. Now, I usually go out in my garden and flick flowers. Anybody do that to get fruit to set? Just a hard knock with your finger on a flower will do the same thing as this buzz pollination will do if you don't have a lot of bees in your garden. Okay, now let's talk about the honeybee. It's funny, we have an entomologist who's in charge of our museum in College Station, Dr. Karen Wright. And Dr. Wright is an expert in the small native bees of the world. And she almost gets disdainful or spiteful when she starts talking about honeybees because they're not native to the U.S. None of our plants here in Texas evolved with honeybees. They're not designed for honeybees. If all the honeybees went away tomorrow, it had absolutely no impact on the ecology of the Texas landscape. What would be who's the big loser if we lose honeybees? We are, because we've bred honeybees to help us pollinate plants and make honey too. But the pollination services of honeybees are actually worth a lot more than the honey in beekeeping. And we use bees. Honeybees are convenient because we can grow them by the thousands in these little boxes. And if we need them over there, we can move the boxes over there. If we need them over there, we can move the boxes over here. So they're very manipulatable. But as far as nature is concerned, honeybees are kind of an anomaly. They're a weird bee. Now, how do you recognize honeybee? So they're a medium-sized bee. They're relatively slow flying. I mean, you see them kind of bzzz along. They're taking their sweet time. The legs tend to hang below them as they fly. The light orange to dark brown base color with dark brown bands. So pretty distinguishable once you kind of develop a mental image for what a honeybee looks like. And again, if you see the pollen balls on the hind legs, that's going to give you another cue. It's probably a honeybee. Could be a bumblebee. And again, that's that golden honey brown color on the adult bees. Now, keep in mind that in Texas, we no longer have purebred European honeybees in the wild. Now, there's two types of bees we're going to encounter outside. One are the domesticated bees that are in managed hives. The others are wild bees or feral bees. They're the ones that have escaped human cultivation and they just live outdoors in the wild. Those bees are almost all Africanized today. If you have a wild beehive in a park or in your backyard, you have to assume that they're Africanized killer bees. What does that mean? Well, it means they have interbred with bees from Africa that are much more aggressive than our docile European honeybees. They tend to be less good honey producers. They tend to abscond, leave the nest a little more frequently. They're harder to manage than our European honeybees. And they're about 10 times more sensitive to nest disturbance than our European honeybees. So what it means is they've got a hair trigger. If you get too close to their nest, they're more likely to respond with a defensive reaction, which is to swarm you and sting. So Africanized honeybees are not nice bees. And for that reason, I usually tell people if you have wild bees in your yard, you need to consider killing them because you don't know what their heritage is, and they're not really doing anybody any good. And there are native bees that can do the same job as those European bees, those Africanized bees. This is on the up left, this is what a beehive looks like when it's exposed. Now, bees tend to make their hives in cavities of trees or in houses, but when they're exposed, this is what they look like. They're long waxen shelves of comb that are full of baby bees, honey, and pollen, depending on the cell. The one on the right, you don't see any of those waxen wings. That's a swarm. When bees colonies get too large, they will split, and at least one half of the nest will go off in search of a new nest site. And they do that in units of 10 to 30,000 bees. There's a lot of bees in a bee swarm. And periodically, the swarm will rest, and they'll land on a specific location. In the middle of that ball of bees is a queen bee. And the workers are protecting her. While they're resting in that tree, there are scout bees from that nest that are going out looking for potential nest sites. And when they find a potential nest site that's suitable, that whole swarm will move into that new nest site. So guess what? If you have the smallest gap in the side of your house, and a scout bee finds that and decides that your house has got a suitable space inside that crack, they will move the whole colony inside your house. And that's not a good thing. This is what happens and why you don't want honeybees to nest in your house. Now, this is a wall that's been cut out, so you can see the hive in the wall of a structure where it had moved in. All the stuff on the bottom is dead bees. And you can imagine that mixed in with wax. In the summer, when the bees have been killed out, some people think, oh, to get rid of that, you just squirt some insecticide in the wall of the house and that'll kill them. Well, if you were successful in doing that, the bees that are dead will pile up at the bottom. The bees are no longer keeping the honeycomb cool, so it will start to melt, and you'll get honey and wax melted in the wall of your house. And what happens to that? Bacteria starts to decay, starts to smell. You get insects that are drawn to that. It's just a mess. So if you ever are unfortunate enough to have wild bees nest in your house, you need to not just kill them with an insecticide, or you need to have that whole hive removed. And that's something that's done by a professional. And you can see this is a professional bee removal job being done on the right. And look at all the insulation had to be pulled out, and a lot of this is wet honeycomb that had been pulled out of the walls. So it's not pleasant. It leaves you with repair costs on your walls, and sometimes it's almost impossible to get honeybees out if it's in a chimney or something like that. Now, a cousin of the honeybee is the bumblebee, and these are native bees. Bombus is one of the genera there. And you'll notice that the hive is very different in a bumblebee. Bumblebees make wax like honeybees do. They have wax glands. But their wax is formed into little balls, hollow balls. And in those balls, they will have sometimes young, but also they will fill them with pollen. Some of them will be full of pollen, and some will be full with a syrupy nectar that has been collected. Now, why don't we eat bumblebee honey? Because it tastes horrible. It's not good like honeybee honey. And I'm not sure exactly why, if it's just not concentrated enough or whatever, but it's not something you want to eat. But these bumblebees have much smaller nests than honeybees, usually a few dozen or so bees. And they are going to be found either underground, or maybe if you have a pile of plant debris or something, sometimes they'll nest under plant leaves and debris. I still remember as a kid sitting on a pile of leaves in the woods behind my backyard and being popped by a bumblebee. I'll never forget that, because that's what stings are supposed to do. They're supposed to create an indelible memory in your brain that you never want to mess with that particular critter again. And it worked for me. So like honeybees, bumblebees carry that mixture of nectar and pollen. They call it the basket on the hind leg is called a corbicula. And you can see the corbicula on this bumblebee here. And bumblebees are actually kind of fun to get and identify. The patterns of yellow and black and sometimes orange colors on the backs of their abdomen and thorax will make it pretty easy to identify bumblebees, even to species. And I think there's a Texas Bumblebees website that you can look up, and it has picture keys that will help you identify your bumblebees. Okay, so that's kind of my introduction to bees, and now you're all bee experts, right? And what we're going to do now is talk about the survey and what we're doing this summer as research. So there are two essential documents for you to have. One is a data sheet like this, and it's just an Excel spreadsheet with some striped cells in it. And it's got the information that we're going to ask you to record when you're out in your garden. The other is the identification guide sheet, color sheet. It's got pictures, some of the same pictures that you saw today in the slide set. And it's got instructions on what we want you to do. So just keep those two documents handy. First thing I want to reassure you, if you're sitting here getting a little nervous, well, it's like, I don't know, I can tell a bee from a fly or anything else. You don't have to be a bee expert to do this research. We're going to keep it as simple as possible and make it so that with a little bit of practice, anybody can do this. And one of the main ways we're doing this is most of what we're asking you to do is classify what you see according to size. Okay? So we're going to have large, medium, and small classification. Large being about 20 millimeters or so in length, medium about 15 millimeters, and small about 10. And we've got examples of what we mean by those in this box up here. So by all means today, make sure you look at that box and get a visual idea of what we're talking about with large, medium, and small. These are actually the categories. If you look on your data sheet, these are the categories that we're asking you to write down. We have LGB for large bees, MB for medium bees, and then we have two small categories, small green bees and small black bees. And then we have HVR, which stands for hoverflies and other flies. I don't know why we picked that acronym. We could have just put FLY, and it would have been just as good, but we decided we live to make things difficult, right? BUT for butterfly, and NBEE for non-bees, okay? So that's what we're asking you to do when you're observing plants in your garden. So let's just see some pictures of these. Now, this is not a very helpful picture because you have no idea how small these bees are. But these are tiny bees. a very common form of the coloration on these bees is going to be black and white stripes on the abdomen. So these are small black bees. Even though they got white stripes, we're calling them black bees. And then we have small green bees. And I don't know why we separate these out exactly, except that there are just a few families that have the brilliant metallic green bees, and they're fairly easy to see. So we put these as a different acronym. So small green bees. And then the honeybee is the good example for a medium-sized bee, about 15 millimeters or so. There are some other bees that would be classified as medium just based on the size. I saw black bees the other day in my garden that I would call medium-sized bees. So the coloration isn't important. We're just more interested in the size. And again, so these are some black and white bees that are in the medium-size range. And large bees. And these are going to be the easiest ones to identify. They're going to be large bumblebee-sized bees. And we're not asking you to even tell whether they're bumblebees or carpenter bees, although with a little practice you can do that. But we just want large bees. And just some pictures of the hoverflies. Again, 2 wings. You can actually see that real easily on this one on the left. And remember, they can look like bees. They can be yellow and black stripes, so don't be fooled by the colors. And there's a robber fly on the left, and it's actually got a little bumblebee in its grasp. So it shows you that predatory nature of the robber fly. So that would also be classified as a hoverfly or other flies. Flesh fly in the middle, large black hairy flies. And that cute little bee fly on the right with a very long proboscis, just a lot like a bee, but again, just 2 wings. That would be a tough one to tell unless you know that general appearance of a bee fly. Wasps and other non-bees. So the one on the left is the paper wasp, and here in Texas, people call them red wasps. They're called a variety, hornets sometimes, but these are the ones that have the nests that you can see the cells in, that's not covered with a paper covering like a hornet's nest would be. Folded wings, there's a paper wasp nest in a tree, so that would be the normal habitat for a paper wasp nest. And another NB, this is the potter wasp or mason wasp. These make the coolest little mud pots that they lay their eggs in with pollen inside. So very cool insects. Anybody ever seen one of these before? Yeah. And then we have other mud daubers, and this is the organ pipe mud dauber on the left. I think this is the orange and black mud dauber in the middle, and that's orange and black mud dauber on the right. So mud, generally speaking, if you ever encounter wasps that are making a mud dauber nest, those are non-social wasps. They will not sting you. They're not dangerous in any way. So there's no reason to have to scrape them off to keep your kids safe. Yeah, they don't sting like a honeybee would. No, they wouldn't reuse those. They're going to make a new one every year. And if you take those and break them open, what you're most likely to find inside is spiders. Most of the mud daubers are spider predators, and they'll stuff those things full of spiders.
Do they come back to the same location year after year?
Not necessarily. I don't necessarily find them coming back every year to the same spot, although I'll usually have 1 or 2 on my back patio show up every summer. And then butterflies, we are going to have you just distinguish whether something's a lepidoptera, a moth or butterfly. It just gets classified as a butterfly in this study. And you will find those, and those are fun to watch. Now, the other thing you're going to see on this form is the bloom, and you're supposed to give a 1 to 3 rating to the bloom. And this is pretty subjective, but Danielle helped put these slides together, and this is Greg's mist flower, I believe. And on the far right, this would be an example of a 0, less than 25% in bloom. A 1, between 25 and 50% of the plants in bloom. 2, between 50 and 75, and above 75 is a 3. So it's subjective. Just do the best you can on that. Make your best estimate of how far that patch of flowers has gone through bloom. That's what we're asking. And just another example, this is on Texas sage. Again, a 0 on the right, a 1, a 2, and a 3. Just your best guesstimate of how far it is. Now, people that study bees will be interested in this kind of data. Okay, now, there are 2 ways to enter data. One is you can take this sheet and make copies of it and do it by hand, and a lot of you prefer to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that, except for you're going to have to get it to us by entering it sending it to us in the mail. The other way should be an easier way, and this is using your cell phone. Now, if you got how many of you have Apple cell phones? Okay, lots. So if you have an Apple, you should be able to hit the camera app and point it at this screen, and it should. It should read that barcode. The barcode is the same barcode that's on this. So you can try it on this. This may work better than the screen. This is my first time to try it to see if I could actually do it on a screen. That's because I didn't have it on photo. I had it on video. So in my cell phone, this automatically brings up a little box, and it's working, and it says open. It says this: open enketo.ona.io. And if you click that, it says that website would like to use your current position, and you say OK. There won't be black helicopters coming around you if you click that. So those of you who are very wary of saying use your position, you should be safe. And that will pull you to our website, our data sheet website. Now I'm going to walk you through this. So you're going to click on that link. Yes, you will allow it to use your current location. This is what you should see, is the Pollinator report form. Now, if you have an Android, you can do the same thing with your Android phone, but Danielle, you said that you might have to download an app. So Snapchat, or get an app that you go on the App Store and search for QR code reader, and you can download an app that will do exactly the same as this.
Or you can always just type in the website URL onto your web browser, and it takes you to the same form. The QR code was just to make it easier.
Yeah. So you should have this that pops up on your phone. This is really easy, and this is going to make it a lot easier. You're not going to have to worry about mailing sheets into us through the mail. So if you're a little timid about using, you can. Yeah, you could do that. You could scan these and email these to Danielle. So let's go through the form on the cell phone. It's going to be basically the same information that's on the written sheet. The one thing that's a little different, it's going to say, is this your first observation within the last 2 hours? This is to help you. You're going to be looking at a minimum of 5 plants in your garden, right? Each time you fill out this form, it will be for one type of plant. If you put yes, it's going to ask you for your basic collection information. If you just did that once for one plant and submitted it, the next time you go back for your second plant, you can click no. And what that does is it's going to skip all the preliminary questions, and it's going to take you right to your observation. So you don't have to keep typing in your location and the pollination percentage and all that stuff. You don't have to do that multiple times. So we're going to say, is this your first observation in the last 2 hours? I'm going to say yes. And it's going to ask you for your email. That's going to be the next thing on here. And the nice thing about this is once I start filling my email in, it's going to have an autofill, and I can just hit the autofill email, and it will come right up. I think, yeah, like that. So I just clicked on email m-merchant@tamu.edu, and it filled in the box. Now here's the other cool thing: is there's a little that circle with the dashes on it. That's your location service. If I press that, what it's going to do is it's going to go out to the wireless signal, and it's going to put my latitude and longitude where I'm standing right now. So you do not have to do anything like type in your address where you're making the collection. Mr. Internet, Mr. Woo-Woo is going to figure out where you are and put it in there. Now, if for some reason that's not working, there's also this map option, and you can click on map, and it will pull up the map of where you are at that moment, and you can center it exactly where you are on the map. So there's two ways. You don't have to do the map, but if you want to, you can. It's pretty neat. I think that's the neatest thing about this. It'll even pull up the altitude that you're at. Current time and date, you're going to fill that in. You're going to put in the temperature. Again, you don't have to do this every time you look at a picture. If you hit that no button the second time, it's going to take in what you already put in. And then it's going to ask you for the plant species and cultivar. The plant species is a required thing. So if you have 5 plants, so you decide I'm going to count bees on these 5 plants, make sure you know what the plants are. It's really important. If you're not certain, you can take a picture of it, but we'd rather you know what it is. And if you don't know, take a picture of it and show it to friends. Make sure that everybody's satisfied, you know what the plant is. Because that's actually the whole purpose of this study, is to figure out which exact plants are most attractive to bees and pollinators. How much of the plant is in bloom? So that's where you're going to enter that, 0 to 3. And then the bloom color. So we want to know what color the flower is. There are some, like salvia, that could be blue or red or whatever. It just helps us make sure we know what the plant is. And then you're going to put in the large bees, medium bees, small bees. And you're going to sit there for a minute, and you're going to count on each of your 5 plants. You're just going to count, oh, there's a bee, small bee, there's a small bee, there's a large bee, there's a large bee. And you're going to count that for a minute, and then you're going to enter those numbers into the data sheet. And that's all it is. If it's a fly, you put HVR, you put it under HVR. And you can do that right here on the phone in real time. And you can see the step is optional. You can provide a photo of the plant. If you have any feedback, if you're so mad at us you could spit because something's not working right, you can write it in there and send us a note, and then you just hit the submit, and that's submitted the plant. Now, if I hit submit, then it's going to, it says I've got errors because I didn't fill in all the fields. But it should take you back to that first question then, is this your first observation in the last 22 hours? And you're going to put no, because you just filled one out. And then it's going to skip all those first questions and take you straight to the data entry portion for that next plant that you're going to look at. Okay, so, and this is from The Tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse by Beatrix Potter. And she met the Babbity Bumble, and Babbity Bumble said, "Ziz, biz, biz." And what he was really saying, she was really saying was, get out there and do your flower observations today, because we need that data. Somebody asked me, I've been asked last couple days on the internet, when do we start? And the answer is, you could start anytime you're ready to start. You all came today to just get a little more comfortable with the process, but all the instructions are really on those forms. And if you know somebody else that would like to be involved in the project, send them to the same place you signed up, and we'll be glad to still sign up new people for the project. Each of you just creates a little bit of data, but in composite, when we start looking at all of you out there, we get some pretty significant information from what you're doing. And with the first survey that we put out, I don't know how many of you filled it out, my other bee collaborators on this project were pretty impressed that we started to narrow down on some plants that were pretty commonly used as bees, as pollinator plants. Within 2 hours is fine. If you get tired after doing 1 minute on one plant, you can take a break, have a Coke or whatever. But most of you are probably going to go out and say, okay, this is my 10 minutes in the garden. I'm going to go out and do my 5 plants all at once. Most people are probably going to do that, I'm guessing. I think it's better for you if you try to pick a time of day and be consistent with it. I'm not going to hold you to that for certain, because we do ask you the time of day, I think in the app. But you're going to find bees are going to be. You're not going to want to go out at 6:30 in the morning, because a lot of the bees will not be active that early. They're daytime flyers. The middle of the day is usually the best time. If you can only get out there in the evening, like after 5 o'clock at night, that's fine. In the summer, we still have plenty of sunlight left in the day. But try to be somewhere in the middle of the day, and if you can, be somewhat consistent in the time of day. It doesn't have to be perfect. Heat does not matter. You will get different bees. There are some bees that love the heat, and they'll be out in the hottest part of the days, and there'll be others that prefer the cooler part of the day. So that's why we're thinking, if you're going to pick a time of day, just stick with it, and you'll get a snapshot of that time of day in your garden. And it might get a little confusing if you're doing some in the morning and some in the evening, because you're going to be getting different answers during those times. Can you switch plants? Yes. If you got a bloom of salvia and they're kind of bloomed out right now for whatever reason, if you want to switch it over to another plant in your garden, that's fine. We don't necessarily want you just picking the plants that are buzzing with bees. We want you to pick out the common plants, maybe your favorite flowers in the garden, because some of them may not have that many bees. And that's what we're trying to find out, is which are the good ones and which are the not so great ones. I'll leave that up to you. Now, the only thing, and Steve and I have talked about this, one of the purposes of this is we want to give people lists of plants that are easy to find and are good growing plants for our area. We don't necessarily want some obscure prairie plant that the only place you can find it is out in the boonies somewhere. Maybe a great pollinator plant, but could you go buy it in the store? No. We want to find stuff that's available on the market that people can use and plant in their backyards. So that there may be some native plants that you have that you want to count, and they're not that common in the stores. That's fine. But we're going to tend to focus in on plants that are commercially very available to the average gardener. We would love you to be out every day for the next 4 months. That would be wonderful. But we realize not everybody can do that. We've asked for a minimum of 1 day a week. So basically, the minimum requirement we're asking from you is 5 minutes a week. We would love if you did 25 minutes a week. If you did 5 minutes every day, that would be great. But it's whatever you can do. Minimum requirement is 5 plants once a week for a minute apiece. Well, this may shock you, as I just don't think that the plants that have been sprayed in the greenhouse are going to be that toxic for very long for bees. By the time they grow out into a full blooming plant in your garden, those insecticides are going to be long gone. So I wouldn't worry about that too much.